I have had and have been shooting video with the Sony a6300 for the last month now. I have to return the camera to Sony New Zealand, so will it be a sad farewell? Here's my thoughts on shooting video with the Sony a6300. Hi, I'm Grant and I have been pretty much testing the video shooting capabilities of this great wee camera out for the last month now. I had heard and read a lot about this camera online, but I have to admit that it wasn't love at first sight with this camera for me. First up, we are spoilt for choice these days with the amount of video functionality that is packed into these small and relatively cheap cameras. For a sub US $1,000 for the camera body only in this camera, it has packed a lot of video functionality in there. The main ones to me are it can shoot 4K video internally. It can also shoot up to 120 frames a second for slow-mo video recording. It has zebras and peaking to help you expose and focus the camera properly. It has an optical viewfinder as well as the LCD monitor for shooting video. And it can record in Sony's S-Log2 and S-Log3 recording formats, although I'm not a big fan of shooting S-Log on these small form cameras. First up, image quality. There is no doubt you can get some beautiful looking video pictures out of this camera. To me, the sweet spot for this camera is its 4K video recording. The 1080 HD video recording, to my eyes, was actually a little bit average. My workflow is still predominantly in 1080, so what worked best for me was shooting in 4K and then down-resing it on a 1080 timeline when I was editing it. I believe this camera actually has a 6K image sensor and it's down-resing to 4K, so perhaps when you are asking it to shoot in HD, I don't know, maybe it's dropping too many pixels or binning too many pixels when recording in 1080. I loved having the ability to shoot 120 frames a second with this camera, and I also discovered that its autofocus is surprisingly good. I did all my testing with this camera with the Sony 18-105 f4 lens, and it did a really good job. It is a nice general purpose lens for shooting video. One thing you'll definitely need when shooting with this camera outdoors on bright days is an ND filter. Even at ISO 100, I was still shooting with very high aperture values, and the only way I was able to get shallow depth of field or get my aperture down was either on cloudy or low light days or putting some variable ND on the front of the lens. Conversely, the camera also shoots really well in low light. I didn't do a lot of low light shooting, but I did some ISO 6400 shooting and the image still looked pretty good to me. Handling. Size-wise, it kind of sits in a little bit of no man's land to me. It is obviously, as it's a mirrorless camera, it is smaller than a traditional style DSLR, but it is still quite a bit bigger than a pocket shooter like the Sony RX100 or G7X. In fact, once you put a lens on, size-wise it's actually fairly comparable to a DSLR such as my Canon 80D. Also, handling wise, I wish that the LCD monitor was touchscreen and that it swiveled right out such as the Canons and Panasonics often have now. One surprise for me where the camera really gained some brownie points is that in my previous video on my channel before this video, if you have a look there, I went and shot some bungee jumping. My original plan was to go and shoot it on a beautiful day, but of course the day I turned up it was hosing down with rain, so therefore using a LCD monitor would be tricky, if not almost impossible, because you'd have wet fingers, you'd be getting a wet screen. So I ended up doing the whole shoot. I put the camera in a shower cap, wrapped it up, and I cut a wee hole in it, and I just used the wee optical viewfinder for the whole shoot, and it did a fantastic job. If I was using a camera such as my Canon 80D, which you can only use the flip out LCD monitor for shooting, I would have struggled in that wet environment, and the monitor or the optical viewfinder worked really well. Another pleasant surprise I found with this camera is its clear zoom digital zoom function. Now, I'm not a fan of digital zoom and I just about always turn them off on all the cameras that I own. However, I read online that somebody had done some tests with it and they said it actually works really well. And what it does is it effectively gives you double your optical focal length. So I did some tests where I did some shooting in 4K, so therefore my lens, when I had the clear zoom digital zoom on, it effectively changed my lens from an 18-105 to an 18-210, or in 35mm equivalent terms, 27 to 315 millimeters, and it worked really well. The ability to have that zoom or a usable zoom range, amazing. No doubt a lot of you that have done some research on this camera and read online that it has quite bad rolling shutter. which it does, and also has overheating issues. The rolling shutter wasn't such a big deal for me, but it's definitely there, and I never shoot continuously in 4K for extended periods of time, so for me, I didn't have any problems with overheating on this camera. So rather than dwelling on the cons or the not so good things about this camera, I thought I'd approach it by saying here's the things that I would love this camera to have to make it an all-round amazing camera. As I mentioned earlier, if it had a touchscreen LCD monitor that actually flipped out and swiveled, that would be fantastic. I would also love to have seen this camera have some built-in ND filter. And my only other thing on my wish list for this camera would have been a built-in headphone jack for monitoring audio when shooting audio where perhaps you're using a radio mic. And that's about it. In conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't love at first sight at this camera for me. However, like a lot of cameras, the more hands-on time you have with them, the better the results you'll start getting from them. Handling wise, it's a little bit no man's land, but it's not a deal breaker for me. However, these days we truly are spoilt for choice in the amount of video features and functionality in small, compact and relatively cheap cameras. Bang for buck, and I'm talking about the video functionality of this camera, this has to be one of the best value cameras on the market at the time of recording this. I also see Sony have just released the successor. Sony are pumping out the cameras at the moment, so they've just released the Sony a6300, which this is still a relatively new camera and it's now succeeding it, so it'll be interesting to see what improvements over this model are on the 6500. So that's it from me. This is going back in a box and on the courier back to Sony New Zealand tomorrow, and I'll well be sad to see it go. Thanks for your time.